The moment the U.S. hit Venezuela, China didn't need to answer with jets. China answered with a lever far more dangerous in 2026. Rare earths and critical components, the invisible parts that keep America's industrial machine from stalling. Because this isn't a story about Caracas, it's a story about choke points. A choke point is the place where the entire system narrows into one fragile passage. You don't have to destroy the system, you just have to squeeze the passage. And in today's world, the most strategic passages aren't only sea lanes like Hormuz or Malacca. They're supply lanes. They're licensing regimes. They're the upstream materials and specialty components that make advanced economies function on time. And China sits on some of the most uncomfortable choke points in the modern economy. That's why Venezuela matters to Beijing far more than most people realize, not as a political cause, but as a strategic oil node. Venezuela represents discounted barrels, flexible supply, and leverage over energy pricing. If Washington tries to break that node through escalation, Beijing's logical response is to raise costs somewhere else, not in the Caribbean. Inside the U.S. economy, here's the brutal reality of modern conflict. Most wars don't start with declarations anymore. They start with ambiguity. And then the world one strike creates a fog. The fog creates miscalculate. Retaliation creates fragmentation. And fragmentation becomes inflation. That's the hidden pathway most viewers miss, because the first casualty of a modern strike isn't a building, it's certainty. Once certainty disappears, everyone starts running internal simulation. Was that a limited is? Who retaliate? What happens to sanctions? What happens to oil? What happens to the dollar? And as soon as those questions enter the market, the world begins pricing risk before facts are fully confirmed, before strategies are fully declared, and before anyone can put the escalation ladder back in the closet. This is why the Venezuela strike is not a regional story. It's a template test. If Washington normalizes force under flexible labels, counter-narcotics, counter-terror, national security, rivals learn two lessons immediately. First, the U.S. will act unilaterally when it believes it can. Second, the best defense is not direct confrontation. It's entanglement. You don't beat the United States by matching it plane for plane. You beat it by forcing it to enforce, patrol, sanction, intercept, justify, and manage day after day until the pressure campaign becomes a permanent machine. That's how empires bleed, not in one decisive battle, but in the maintenance costs of too many small commitments. And China understands that better than almost anyone. So China doesn't have to enter the Venezuela theater with soldiers. China only needs to do three things. Keep the target from collapsing too fast, make U.S. enforcement harder to sustain, and tighten the economic choke points that turn a foreign crisis into domestic pain. That third step is the one that should scare you. Because rare earths and critical components don't need a dramatic embargo to hit like a weapon. They just need friction, a delayed export license, a tighter end-user check, a longer compliance review, a sudden paperwork requirement. A shipment that moves slower becomes more expensive, becomes less predictable. Supply chains don't collapse like in the movies. They seize like an engine. First comes friction, then comes heat, then comes breakdown. And the breakdown is where inflation comes back. Rare earths aren't a niche topic for engineers. They sit inside precision magnets and specialized parts that flow into motors, robotics, drones, aerospace components, industrial automation, and a surprising amount of defense-related manufacturing. Even where substitutes exist, switching is slow, expensive, and disruptive. So when China tightens that pipeline, American firms respond in predictable ways. They hoard inventory. They overorder to create buffers. They pay higher premiums for secure delivery. They postpone investment because planning becomes harder. They pass costs forward wherever they can. That is the definition of cost-push inflation. Prices rise, not because demand is overheated, but because production becomes more expensive and less reliable. And cost-push inflation is the worst kind politically, because you can't stimulus your way out of it without making it worse. You can't vote it away. You can't spin it away. It shows up at the register in replacement parts, in repair bills, in delayed projects, in smaller margins, in layoffs, in postponed expansions. Now connect the dots. If the U.S. escalates abroad while China tightens industrial chokepoints, the American economy gets hit on two fronts: a security front that consumes attention, resources, and political bandwidth, and an economic front that raises costs, squeezes supply chains, and threatens inflation. That's where the 2026 nightmare forms. Because the moment inflation risk rises again, monetary policy becomes trapped. Central banks live inside credibility loops. If inflation expectations lift, especially through visible supply friction, rate cuts become harder. Lower rates soon becomes politically dangerous. Markets start pricing higher for longer again. In the ugly scenario, rates don't just stay elevated, they rise again. And that's when a foreign conflict becomes a global financial problem, because high U.S. rates don't stay inside the United States. They export through the dollar. Here's the paradox. During crises, money often runs into the dollar even when the U.S. is at the center of the shock. Not because the world is cheering for Washington, but because the dollar is still the deepest pool of liquidity when panic hits. So the chain reaction goes global. The dollar strengthens. Global financial conditions tighten. Emerging market currencies weaken first. Credit spreads widen. Refinancing becomes harder. Capital retreats to safety. The weakest balance sheets crack before the strongest even notice. That's why emerging markets feel the shock first, because they're most sensitive to dollar tightening and geopolitical uncertainty. The stress transmits through funding costs faster than it transmits through trade. And while markets are repricing risk, governments respond the way they always do when costs rise. They blame outsiders. They restrict exports. They subsidize domestic champions. They retaliate. They build walls. That creates the dark feedback loop. Higher costs, political blame, export controls, retaliation, deeper fragmentation. Fragmentation then creates even more cost and delay, which feeds inflation risk again. It becomes self-sustaining. And here's the part that turns this into a strategic trap. Once sanctions, interdictions, and enforcement expand, the U.S. inherits a maintenance burden it can't escape. Pressure campaigns require constant policing of shipping routes, payment rails, intermediaries, insurers, traders, and compliance networks. And constant policing creates incidents. One interception goes wrong. One warning maneuver becomes escalation. One drone is misread. One cyber attack hits a port and gets blamed on the wrong actor. One false report goes viral and forces a real response because leaders can't afford to hesitate. That's how the operational environment gets poisoned. Not through one giant explosion, but through the accumulation of small risks that keep the escalation ladder leaning forward. This is why the real danger isn't whether the Venezuela operation was limited. The real danger is that once force becomes plausible, everyone starts calculating based on a new reality. And rivals don't need to defeat the U.S. to benefit from that reality. They only need to keep the U.S. managing enforcement, managing incidents, managing coalitions, managing domestic politics, managing inflation risk, managing interest rate expectations, managing credibility. That's the definition of entanglement. So when you hear Venezuela, don't think regional conflict, think system test. Because if a single theater becomes a template, the world moves into a phase where escalation is easier than de-escalation. And when that becomes true, crises stop being exceptions. They become baseline, not one dramatic world war headline. A slower, uglier outcome. A world that is more expensive, more divided, and harder to stabilize because the most powerful weapons are not always missiles. Sometimes they're licenses. Sometimes they're magnets. Sometimes they're components that never make the news until they're missing. And once you see the system this way, the question is no longer, will this become a war? The question becomes, how many choke points can be tightened before the global economy stops functioning like one system and starts functioning like competing blocks? Because in 2026, the most dangerous kind of conflict is the kind that spreads through networks. And networks break quietly until they don't. The next phase isn't explosions. It's enforcement. That's where empires get trapped. Because the moment a strike happens, a government can claim it was limited and surgical, necessary, but the system doesn't care what you call it. The system cares whether you can hold the line after you cross it. If Washington wants Venezuela to stay pressured, it has to keep showing up. And showing up is not a speech, it's a machine. It's surveillance, interdiction, compliance pressure, banking restrictions, insurance restrictions, shipping controls, legal pressure, diplomatic arm twisting, constant monitoring of intermediaries, a permanent hunt for evasion networks. That's the unseen cost of modern coercion. Once you turn pressure into a campaign, you inherit the upkeep. And upkeep is where the crisis expands, because upkeep produces the one thing every strategist fears: incidents. A tanker refuses inspection. A boarding goes wrong. A warning maneuver becomes a collision. A drone appears in the wrong place at the wrong time. A port outage hits a key node and nobody can prove who did it. One misread radar contact, one viral clip, one unverified claim. Suddenly you're responding to something you didn't plan to respond to. And once you respond, you create a precedent. Then you're not managing one escalation ladder. You're managing multiple ladders at once, and every ladder has its own logic, its own politics, its own media pressure, its own "we can't look weak" trap. This is why limited operations fail. Not because the first move is impossible, but because the second-order effects don't stay limited. Now look at what the opponent does in this environment. Venezuela cannot match U.S. power conventionally. So if it retaliates, it won't be symmetrical. It will be survivable and messy. It will target friction, not victories. Cyber disruption, interference with communications, pressure through irregular networks, harassment of assets linked to allies, anything that turns the operating environment from clean to dirty, from predictable to unpredictable. Because unpredictability is a weapon. It forces you to spend more to get the same result, and once you are spending more, you are already losing something: time, attention, and domestic patience. And domestic patience is where great powers truly break. Because every pressure campaign eventually collides with the same question: what is the legal authority? What is the end state? What counts as success? And why are we still paying for it? This is how foreign escalation becomes domestic controversy. The moment costs rise, people ask for the exit plan. The moment the exit plan looks blurry, support fragments. And the moment support fragments, leaders become even more tempted to escalate again to prove the operation is working. That is the political loop that traps you. You escalate to avoid looking weak, and the escalation creates the very conditions that make you weaker. Now place China into this picture. China doesn't need to save Venezuela dramatically. China just needs to prevent the clean victory. Because preventing clean victory forces the U.S. into longer enforcement, and longer enforcement creates more incidents, and more incidents create more political stress. So China's smartest move is not to show up with soldiers. It's to show up with oxygen, financial oxygen, logistical oxygen, industrial oxygen, just enough to keep Venezuela alive and difficult to break, while keeping China's fingerprints light. This is what modern great power interference looks like. It doesn't aim to win the war in a cinematic way. It aims to shift the cost curve so the other side doesn't want to keep paying. And the most powerful way to shift that cost curve is to hit the home front. That's where rare earths and critical components become more than economics. They become strategy. Because when China tightens those choke points, the pain lands inside the U.S. production system. Factories don't stop overnight. They slow. They reschedule. They miss delivery windows. They pay premiums. They build buffers. They duplicate inventory. They increase working capital. They raise prices. They postpone projects that depend on uncertain inputs. That's not just inflation. That's a productivity hit. It's the kind of silent damage that doesn't look dramatic until you look at the economy months later and wonder why everything costs more and growth feels weaker. And once inflation risk starts to rise again, even slightly, it spreads through expectations. Businesses expect higher costs, so they price higher. Workers expect higher prices, so they demand higher wages. Investors expect tighter policy, so they demand higher yields. Credit gets tighter. Risk assets reprice. Then the macro loop completes itself. A geopolitical event turns into a monetary regime shift. This is the nightmare scenario for the United States. Trying to manage a new enforcement theater while inflation pressure returns through supply friction. Because supply-driven inflation is politically toxic. You can't fix it by boosting demand. That makes it worse. You fix it by stabilizing supply, reducing uncertainty, lowering costs, and restoring trust across trade routes. But if the world is fragmenting into blocks, supply stability becomes harder. So central banks get boxed in. If inflation expectations rise, policymakers lose freedom. Rate cuts become harder. "We'll ease soon" becomes a promise they might not be able to keep. Markets start to price higher for longer again. And once that happens, tight financial conditions spread outward. And this is where the story becomes global. Because the world doesn't finance itself in neutral currency. It finances itself in dollars. When uncertainty spikes, capital hides in the deepest pool of liquidity. That's the dollar. Not because the dollar is morally right, but because the system is built that way. So global investors pull back. Emerging markets feel it first. Currencies weaken. Credit spreads widen. Refinancing becomes harder. The weakest balance sheets crack. And when they crack, it creates headlines that feed fear, which feeds more capital flight. That's how a regional strike can begin to tighten conditions in countries that aren't even on the map of the conflict. And once you have global tightening, you get political reactions everywhere. Governments respond to rising costs the way they always do. They blame outsiders and they protect domestic industries. They restrict exports. They subsidize. They retaliate. And that's how the feedback loop locks in. Higher costs, political blame, export controls, retaliation, deeper fragmentation. At that point, the system is no longer drifting. It's accelerating toward a new baseline. A baseline where crises don't end cleanly because no one wants to pay the political price of de-escalation. And rivals don't need to defeat you. They only need to keep you managing. Because management is exhaustion. Here's the part people underestimate. The world doesn't collapse from one explosion. It collapses from momentum. Momentum is what happens when every actor feels forced to keep moving because stopping looks like weakness, hesitation looks like loss, and backing down becomes politically unaffordable. That's how the third phase begins, not with a bigger strike, with the system tightening around itself. Because once enforcement becomes routine, the conflict expands into three arenas that don't stay local: energy pricing, shipping friction, and sanctions architecture. And when those three start moving at the same time, the global economy doesn't need a formal war to feel like one. Energy is first, not because Venezuela controls the world's oil, but because markets trade on fear faster than they trade on facts. The moment investors sense a theater is live, they price the risk premium into everything: insurance, freight, financing, inventory, and delivery timelines. Even if physical supply isn't gone, the cost of moving it becomes uncertain, and uncertainty becomes a price. That's how oil becomes inflation. Then shipping becomes the hidden battlefield. When interdiction, inspections, seizures, and compliance pressure increase, the response is not a dramatic naval showdown. It's an evasion ecosystem: rerouting, blending cargo, ship-to-ship transfers, flag changes, intermediaries, alternative insurers, and paperwork laundering. It turns trade into a maze. And mazes do one thing reliably: they raise costs. Every added layer of friction is a tax on the real economy. It makes everything slower, pricier, and harder to plan. Businesses don't invest aggressively when supply is unpredictable. They hoard and they hedge. They build buffers. They over-order. They pay premiums. And premiums eventually show up in consumer prices. So by the time politicians are still debating the morality of the strike, the system has already begun repricing the future. Next comes the sanctions spiral. And this is where the world truly fractures. Sanctions are not a clean weapon. They are a network weapon. The moment sanctions become central, the battlefield becomes banks, insurers, traders, shipping registries, ports, compliance departments, and payment rails. And once those systems are weaponized, every major power starts building the only rational response: alternatives. Alternative routing, alternative finance, alternative settlement, alternative logistics, alternative partnerships. The more aggressively a superpower tries to enforce economic pressure, the faster the rest of the world learns how to operate without that superpower's permission. That's the dark irony. Enforcement can win battles and lose decades. And this is where China's role becomes decisive, because China doesn't need to win the Venezuela story on television. China needs to win it in math. China's best move is to keep the U.S. stuck in maintenance while shifting pain into the U.S. economy through choke points. That's why rare earths and critical components are so powerful. They don't need to be cut off to cause damage. They only need to become uncertain. A delayed license, a tighter end-user requirement, a longer compliance review, a shipment rerouted, a part stuck in limbo. That kind of friction doesn't trigger one dramatic headline, but it creates something worse, a sustained degradation of efficiency. Production slows, costs rise, projects slip, inventories get hoarded, firms postpone investment. Over time, the economy begins to feel heavier. And when the economy feels heavier, inflation becomes dangerous again. Because it's not demand-driven, it's supply-driven. It's the kind of inflation that makes people feel poorer even if nominal growth exists. That's when central banks get trapped. If inflation pressure returns through supply friction, policymakers lose room to ease. Rate cuts become harder to justify. Markets start pricing higher for longer again, and higher for longer isn't just a U.S. story. It's a global tightening mechanism, because the world is still priced in dollars. When uncertainty rises and rates stay high, capital moves toward liquidity and safety. That means the dollar strengthens, funding becomes scarcer, and emerging markets absorb the shock first. Their currencies weaken, their credit spreads widen, refinancing becomes painful, the weakest balance sheets crack, and cracks become contagion because fear spreads faster than fundamentals. That's the financial transmission line that turns geopolitics into global stress. Now add one more layer, domestic politics. Because no pressure campaign stays abroad. It always comes home. Once costs rise, people ask for an end state. Once an end state looks unclear, support starts to fracture. Once support fractures, leaders become tempted to escalate again to prove control. That is how policy becomes trapped by narrative. Leaders become prisoners of momentum, and momentum creates error rate. One misread radar contact, one drone incident, one cyber attack blamed on the wrong actor, one tanker boarding that goes wrong, one false report that forces a real response because nobody can afford to hesitate. That's the empire killer. Not a single decisive defeat, but a portfolio of risks that compounds until the system is always reacting. So the real question isn't whether Venezuela becomes a major war. The real question is whether Venezuela becomes a template, a repeatable pattern. Force becomes plausible. Enforcement becomes routine. Retaliation becomes systemic. Choke points become weapons. Costs rise. Inflation pressure returns. Rates stay high. The dollar tightens the world. Emerging markets crack first. Governments blame outsiders. Export controls expand. Retaliation expands. Fragmentation deepens. That is the loop. And once it starts running, it doesn't require anyone to choose escalation anymore. The system will carry it forward because every actor will be optimizing for survival inside a world that punishes weakness. That's why this story matters. Because the most dangerous phase of any conflict is the phase where nobody fully owns what just happened. But everyone starts acting as if the worst case is possible. In that gap, the world doesn't wait for certainty. It manufactures momentum. And momentum is how a regional strike becomes a global crisis without ever being called a world war.